My name is John Chadima. I am the president of the Johnson County Historical Society Board. On behalf of the board, I'd like to welcome all of you, along with the staff and those that are members and those that should be members of the Johnson County Historical Society, hint, hint, welcome you this afternoon to this event. Really pleased and honored that we have a collaboration with the African American Historical Museum and Cultural Center of Iowa, which, for those of you that don't know, is just up the road on 380 in Cedar Rapids. Hopefully it's one of many collaborations over the years to come. It's my honor to introduce to you a man who many of you do know and have known for many years here in Iowa City, Dr. Philip Hubbard, who is a professor emeritus and vice president emeritus of the University of Iowa. The only way I'd put this is Professor Hubbard's maybe love affair began with the university back in 1946 as a student, ultimately earning his PhD in hydraulics in 1954, which was just a year before I was born, Dr. Hubbard. As a student, as a teacher, as an administrator, his tenure spanned a very exciting and active time both in the history of America and at the University of Iowa, retiring in 1991 as a University of Iowa vice president. Kind of reading about Dr. Hubbard, it kind of came to mind here that a major legacy to the university was his leadership regarding human rights and affirmative action related to the makeup of students, faculty, and the staff. We're grateful for his hard work and dedication, and believe me, this community is far better off place to live because of your efforts. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Hubbard.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chadima, and I'd like to express appreciation for the turnout. It's wonderful. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Johnson County Historical Society for sponsoring today's event, and to hear Joe McGill. Until recently, there was no generally acceptable place to obtain information about the culture and history of African Americans in Iowa, perhaps because of their relatively small number and the lack of research about their activities and accomplishments. Local newspapers and the statewide Iowa Bystander were valuable sources for current events, but their articles, editorials, and advertisements were inadequate for a balanced and complete record. I have no credentials whatever as a historian, but in my retirement years, I did some research for the University of Iowa's sesquicentennial celebration. In that connection, I collected information about human rights in Iowa, with special attention given to ethnic minorities and especially to African Americans. Published research by Professor Dorothy Schweder of Iowa State University was valuable, and a 1948 study by Leola Nelson Bergman titled The Negro in Iowa that was published in the Iowa Journal, then updated and reprinted by the State Historical Society of Iowa in 1969. That source was supplemented by information from the Iowa Bystander and my own experience, but my efforts would have been much more complete and valuable if a central collection, such as the ones under development in the African American Museum, had been available. Considerable progress has been made in the last few years. The collection about African American women in the Louise Noun Women's Archives in the University of Iowa Library is a valuable step forward, and Professor Charlene Barnes at the University of Northern Iowa has published a photographic history of African Americans in Iowa. These advances are welcome, but not as comprehensive as the work that will now be described by Joe McGill, Jr. Mr. McGill graduated from Kingstree High School in Kingstree, South Carolina, and then went into the to the United States Air Force as a security policeman in England, the state of Washington, and Germany. After military service, he attended South Carolina State University, graduating with a bachelor's degree in professional English. From 1988 to 1995, he was a park ranger at the Fort Sumter National Monument in Charleston, South Carolina, giving oral presentations on Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, supervising volunteers and participating in living history presentations, parades, and battle reenactments. From 1995, he was Director of History and Culture at Penn Center at St. Helena Island, South Carolina. The Penn School was the first one built during the Civil War for the education of recently freed slaves. As director, he was responsible for the overall development and implementation of the center's program for collecting, preserving, and making public the history of Penn Center and the Sea Island African American history and culture. While all of this was going on, Mr. McGill founded Company I, 54th Massachusetts Reenactment Regiment. The 54th Volunteer Regiment was portrayed in the movie Glory. As a reenactor, he participates in parades, living history presentations, and battle reenactments. Joe appears in the book Confederates in the Attic by Tony Horitz and appeared in the History Channel documentary called The Unfinished Civil War, which you probably saw that last night on television on the History Channel. He was filmed in the battle reenactment of the Olustee, Florida protest march against the flying of the Confederate flag over the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, spending the night in a slave cabin at Boone Hall Plantation at Mount Pleasant, and at the lowering of the Confederate flag for the final time from atop the State House dome in South Carolina. In case you wonder what Joe does in his spare time, Mr. McGill is currently a Rotarian, a board member for the United Way of Eastern Iowa, and a commissioner for the Commission on the Status of African Americans. As a speaker for the Humanities Iowa Speakers Bureau, Joe's subject is the role of African Americans in the Civil War, with an emphasis on Iowa. Without further ado, I present Joseph McGill, Jr., Executive Director of the African American Historical Museum and Cultural Center of Iowa. Joe.
That was quite an introduction. Thank you for that. And thank the Johnson County Historical Society for inviting me here today. When Mr. Hubbard was introduced, it was not mentioned that he is assisting us in our efforts to build the African American Historical Museum and Cultural Center of Iowa. We strive to make this a museum that's going to interpret the history of all African Americans throughout the state. So to that end, we go into every community and identify with people that can help us bring this to pass. And Dr. Herbert has been assisting us in doing just that. He has been identifying those potential members, those potential fundraisers out there that can assist us in raising the additional funds that we need to raise to build the museum. Now, as far as the museum is concerned, it is a $2.8 million capital campaign that we're in right now. We've raised about $2 million of that, so we have an additional $800,000 to raise. In fact, last week we made an announcement. Aegon donated $100,000 to that effort, and they are naming the library inside the facility. So if we get about 7 or 8 more gifts like that, we'll be through with this. And I also want to recognize one of our board members that's in the audience right now, Mr. Joseph Henry, that's also helping us identify the folks around the state who we should be talking to, not only for funds, but for those stories out there that we need to tell inside the facility, because we don't want to leave anybody out of the picture. And we know that with the limited staff that we have, it's going to be a team effort to make sure that we don't miss out on anybody's story. One thing that I found out when I first heard about the job here in in Iowa. There I was minding my own business in South Carolina, and I saw an ad for the executive director for a museum in the making that's going to interpret the history of African Americans in Iowa. Now, when I first read that, I had a little chuckle because I couldn't relate the state of Iowa and African Americans. It just wouldn't fit for me. And then I started to do some research, and as I continued to do my research, I learned about the Lewis and Clark expedition. That when those men came here early in the 1800s into the Louisiana Territory, when this area was just a territory, there was a slave on this expedition. But the amazing thing about that is once he got past the region of the slave states, he by default became a free man. So when I go up to Sioux City, I always let them know that they're a part of that story that we're going to be telling in the museum, because stories like this shouldn't be a secret, and stories like this shouldn't be put back on the shelf after the month of February. But as I continued to do my research, I found out about Dred Scott in the fact that that court case said that no blacks had any rights that any whites had to respect or observe. And the amazing thing about that is that Dred Scott is related to the history of this state, because Dred Scott spent some time in the state of Iowa, and that's what he based his case before the court on, the fact that he had spent some time in a free state. But even before the Dred Scott case, a case that was argued before the Iowa Supreme Court was the case of Ralph on July 4th, 1839. We know more about Dred Scott because, of course, that has national significance. But the case of Ralph is just as important because, you know, that shows that the state of Iowa was kind of in the forefront of those efforts. We hear about Josiah Grinnell. We find out that when Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young man," one of the people that he was talking to was Josiah Grinnell, and that is what the city of Grinnell is actually named for. And let me read you some information about Josiah Grinnell. Josiah Grinnell was born in 1821. He was a pioneer, preacher, politician, and moralist, and the founder of a community and the promoter of a college. Grinnell was a Republican who fought to keep slavery out of Iowa. Good man. He opened his home to his friend, John Brown, and his army. Grinnell gave advice to Brown to facilitate Brown's plan and communicated with him frequently by mail. Grinnell's huge wool barn became one of the stations on the Underground Railroad. His workmen were excited whenever word came for one of the boys to hurry fugitives on the next station 35 miles away. Because this state is geographically located between those two great rivers, the Mississippi and the Missouri, there was a considerable amount of Underground Railroad activities here in this state. Most of that activity took place south of Interstate 80. Now, it's not as much activity as some would wish, but there was activity here nonetheless. We know about John Brown. We know about John Brown because he is of national significance. Where I'm from down south, he's looked upon as a traitor of sorts. But we know that as far as African Americans are concerned, we can kind of tie that into the real start of the Civil War, because in 1859, John Brown and his activities really brought to the forefront the struggles that slaves were enduring at that time. But the significance to this state is that John Brown actually trained black men from this state, in this state, took those men with him to Virginia and started that revolt. One amazing thing about that revolt is in 1859, when they were surrounded in that armory in Harper's Ferry, a group of Marines was sent in to capture him and bring him to justice. The commander of those Marines was Robert E. Lee. And we know that Robert E. Lee went on to do bigger and better things during the Civil War. Now, we don't know, we probably have heard the name Alexander Clark. Alexander Clark is quite significant in the history of Iowa. And I want to read you a little paragraph here on Mr. Alexander Clark. In 1867, Alexander Clark's 12-year-old daughter, Susan, was prevented from entering Muscatine's Grammar School No. 2 because she was an African American. They sued the school district and took their case to the Iowa Supreme Court. The court ruled that in Susan's favor in 1868. She enrolled at the school. The ruling led to the integration of all Iowa schools. Susan became the first African American woman to graduate from high school in Muscatine and possibly the state. Her siblings, Rebecca and Alexander Jr., also graduated from a Muscatine high school. In 1880, Alexander Jr. became the first African American to earn a law degree from the University of Iowa. Alexander Clark Sr. was the second African American to earn his law degree from the University of Iowa. In 1890, he served as counsel to Liberia. As we continue to study the African American history of Iowa, we cannot miss the information out there about Buxton. Buxton is an Iowa story, pure Iowa story. Coal mining communities in the state of Iowa were quite prominent in the early 1900s. In fact, as these coal mining communities would prosper, they eventually would dry up. The coal reserves would dry up, and mysteriously a fire would start, and the coal mining communities would move. But one of these communities was Buxton. And the amazing thing about Buxton is the fact that the majority of that population at one point were African Americans. And on some accounts, it's called the Black Utopia. And there are still descendants of Buxton that we talk to today that help us document the Buxton story. We researched the fact that baseball in the African American community was quite prominent at one point in Iowa, especially the early 1900s. But one thing that we find out, one thing that we have found out is that not all of the history about baseball in Iowa is good. Because we went to Marshalltown and we started doing some research, just as we go to every county and do research about African American history. And we find out that all the history in these counties is not good. Because once we were there, we started uncovering stuff about KKK. And then we came across this one name, this gentleman by the name of Cap Anson. We hear about the story of Jackie Robinson and him integrating baseball. But there were efforts in the late 1800s to integrate baseball far beyond that time. But this one gentleman by the name of Cap Anson, who was a baseball player from Marshalltown, a white baseball player from Marshalltown, spearheaded the effort to prevent that from happening. And because of his efforts, it didn't happen at that time. So as I said, all the information that we come across is not pretty. And the information that we're going to be interpreting in the museum, we're not going to sugarcoat anything. We're just going to put it out there as we know it and let you be the judge of what is there. We learn about the history of Fort Des Moines. Fort Des Moines is prominent because during World War I and World War II, any African American wanting to be an officer in the Army would at some point have to go through Fort Des Moines in Des Moines. Tuskegee Airmen that were so prominent in World War II at some point went through training in Des Moines, eventually went to, of course, Tuskegee, Alabama. But there was a story of one that's near and dear to me. And the reason why this story is near and dear to me is because it just so happened we acquired a letter from this particular Tuskegee Airmen. This letter is now in our possession in our archives. This letter, this gentleman, this Tuskegee Airman, is originally from Dubuque. He attended the University of Iowa. One of his colleagues, a white gentleman, after graduation wanted to reestablish contact with all his classmates, so he did. He was doing a newsletter. And in his efforts to reestablish this contact, this Tuskegee Airman wrote him a letter, the letter that's now in our possession. The letter is dated 1944. The Tuskegee Airman had been transferred from Tuskegee, Alabama, to my home state of South Carolina. Walterboro, South Carolina is where he was receiving his training at the time. And at the place that he was receiving his training were German prisoners. And he writes in the letter that the German prisoners were getting better treatment than the black soldiers were, the Tuskegee Airmen were. And he goes on to write, where's the real fight? Is it over in Europe, or is it here in the United States dealing with the treatment of blacks? We know about W.B. Du Bois. We know that he is the founder of the NAACP, but it is not widely known that W.B. Du Bois was married to Nina Gomer. And let me read you a little bit about Nina Gomer. Nina Gomer Du Bois was the daughter of Charles Gomer, a successful chef who sent Nina to Wilberforce University in Ohio. There, she met the future founder of the NAACP, W.B. Du Bois. They were married in Cedar Rapids on May 12, 1896. 1 year later, W.B. Du Bois and Nina had a son named Berger. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, but the point is, Nina Gomer is a Cedar Rapidian. For those of you who are graduates of Iowa State University, I'm sure there are some of you out there, we hold it up proudly. We hear the name Jack Trice quite a bit. In fact, we relate that name to the stadium, Jack Trice Stadium. But the story of Jack Trice shouldn't be only known amongst the graduates of Iowa State University. We need to know that Jack Trice was the first African-American football player on that team. We also need to know that he died of injuries received from a game that he played. So we do all this research to bring all of these kind of stories forward. When we go to the Des Moines area, one story that we like to relate is the story of Edna Griffin. We hear a lot about Rosa Parks. We know that she was a national figure because of her efforts, her actions that related to the civil rights effort, Martin Luther King and what he eventually did, the bus boycott. We know about that. But we know very little about Edna Griffin. We don't know the fact that in 1948 that she wanted to go into a drugstore, Cat's drugstore in Des Moines, and be served ice cream. She was denied that opportunity because she was an African American. She took the case to court and she won. She only won $1, but she won nonetheless. So I think that Edna Griffin is our civil rights leader. So we do have people of that type that live here in this state. I was talking to a gentleman here by the name of Mr. Lyle Henry. He's in the audience. And one thing that we know, one thing that's a fact, is that travel for African Americans in the 1940s, 50s, 60s was not as glamorous as it was for whites. You know, we couldn't stay in the hotels. We couldn't use restrooms in certain places, or at least not adequate ones. So the travel was not as glamorous. There was the Lincoln Highway that ran through the state of Iowa. On the Lincoln Highway, right in the Cedar Rapids area, was the Sepia Motel. The Sepia Motel was built and owned by Mr. Cecil Reed. Cecil Reed was the first African American elected to the Iowa State legislature. and he owned the Sepia Motel. And the reason for that Sepia Motel is because of what I just described. This was one of few places that African Americans could go and be accommodated. We're spearheading an effort. We're trying to identify some funds that can help us do some excavating on that site. So if you can help us along those lines in identifying funds, pointing us in the right direction, or being a part of that committee that we're putting together to make this happen, please see me after the presentation, and we'll talk more about that. When we hear about Black history, one of the most prominent people that we hear about is, of course, Martin Luther King, and the significance of Martin Luther King being in this state is important. Of course, before his assassination, he did come here and speak at colleges such as Cornell and Cole College in Cedar Rapids. The cases of people that I just talked briefly about is just that it's brief. The point I want to get across is that we're out there, we're doing that research. The jury is still out. There are 99 counties in this state. Of those 99 counties, I know there are some that, right now, there are no African Americans living in those counties. But has that always been the case? We don't know that. We need to find that out. We are also striving to be the stewards of the African American history that exists in this state. We will be a one-stop shop for anyone wanting to know more about African American history. We don't want to lose the story of Dr. Hubbard. We don't want to lose the story of the other prominent African Americans that reside right here in this county. But we want to make it known that this project that we're doing is not only about Cedar Rapids, but all of these counties, because these stories that I just related to you are from all across the state. And there is a lot that I didn't touch on. The Sioux City Ghost, that was one of those African-American baseball teams that was so prominent in this state. There is a lot of individuals on this particular list here that I did not read about. The history of African-American women in this state is quite rich. I got involved in a project when I first got here. I wanted to get artists and crafters involved in helping us to tell the story that we're trying to tell about African Americans in this state. So I used the shotgun effect and just sent invitations everywhere for folks to get involved, voluntarily, of course. And we did get some responses. One lady responded to me and said, you know, I work with clay. I can form clay into pretty much anything you want me to form it into. And I'll volunteer my services, but my only stipulations are, well, my one stipulation is my subject has to be a female, and you have to find that subject. So I started doing the research, and I came to the Women's Archive here at the university, and the one lady that all my research pointed to was Virginia Harper. And I took that information, presented it to the artist, and she said, well, yeah, this is the lady. So I employed the assistance of Virginia's sister, Lois Ihacker. She was going to be the point person to make this thing happen. When the artist met Lois, she was so fascinated by Lois's story, she did a bust of Lois. So now we've got two busts that we're going to be putting into the museum. And by the way, Lois is now the president of our board for the museum. So now we've got two busts of these prominent ladies in the state of Iowa that we will be putting into the museum and interpreting their story. I'm going to give you, that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. One thing that I want to say before I end the presentation is that I have information over here. I've got some information on a presentation that I'll be doing at Grinnell, for those of you who want to venture there. I've got some information on how you could become members of the organization. I've also got our most recent newsletter, and I've got some information over there from Humanities Iowa. You might be interested in Humanities Iowa brochure newsletter, because next week I will be coming back to Iowa. I'll be coming to the university to take part in a presentation, but the subject of this presentation will be specifically the documentary that I appeared in, that was aired on the History Channel last night. But in addition to you seeing me, also there will be the other gentleman that was featured in the documentary, the guy that portrayed the Confederate side of the story. But additionally, the producer will be coming in from California to take part in this documentary. We'll be doing it at the University of Iowa and Iowa State University. So I've got all that information there. Margaret, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the Johnson County Historical Society. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them for you.
I was wondering if there's cooperation between your organization and the one that's forming up in the Waterloo, Cedar Falls area.
There is, not to the extent that we share any funding or funding sources. Now, there have been efforts on our part to assist. We have been in existence. I think they're probably about 2 years younger than we are. And I don't know where exactly they are financially. The agreements that we've made as far as what we collect, Black Hawk County is almost taboo, almost. But because we're telling a story of statewide significance, there are stories, there are snippets of stories there that we cannot help collecting. So we kind of infringe in those senses. There's a doctor in McGregor, Iowa, Dr. Clifford Smith, who is originally from Black Hawk County, from the Waterloo area. But because his story is of statewide significance, the fact that he was a Tuskegee Airman, the fact that he is the only doctor in McGregor, in fact, the only African-American in McGregor, for miles, and for him to have such prominence in that area, we have to have that story. And we've got that story. In fact, we've got artifacts from him. But as far as the story that Waterloo is telling, they're telling the story of African Americans in Waterloo. You know, at one point, the railroad ended. It didn't go any further north. That's where the railroad ended. So that accounts for a lot of the African Americans in Waterloo. Something else that accounts for the high number of African Americans in Waterloo is that a lot of them came as strike breakers for various manufacturers that were there at some point. So that accounts for that story. And that's the story that they're telling. Ours has a more statewide appeal. Just as we're not infringing on the story that the Fort Des Moines project is going to tell. They're going to tell that story, that military story of those officers, of those blacks who wanted to be officers in the Army. Ours will take some of that, but we'll tell that statewide story. Yes, sir.
Can you tell about your family life, please?
Yes, I am originally from South Carolina, born and raised in South Carolina. I come from a family of 6. I'm the oldest son. I've got 3 older sisters. I'm pretty much the only one that ventured away. All of my sisters and brothers are still staying in the state of South Carolina. I've got 2 brothers that stay in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. All my other sisters are staying in Kingstree, South Carolina. And when I graduated from high school, I went immediately into the Air Force, so I'm kind of the odd family member out. I've always been the farthest away from the family, but we've still got a close-knit family. My father died in 1991. My mom's still alive. And for the most part, we've got a nice, close-knit family. Back right there.
Just to add something that you perhaps know, but I just wanted to punctuate it. When you talked about the case of Ralph, you said it was a case from the Iowa Supreme Court, and maybe it would be good for the audience to punctuate. It was the first case in the Iowa Supreme Court in 1839. And the thing I've always found interesting about it is that since Iowa was a territory at the time and not yet a state, technically one could argue that the case was actually argued in a federal judiciary. Arguably then it was, and it was one of Dred Scott's thoughts when he was doing his case, that it should have been the reference point, because actually it would have been the law of the country federally, but I'm not going to remember his name, from Mississippi, who was on the Supreme Court, chose quite deliberately to ignore that. And the other thing that might be interesting along the lines that south of Highway 34 in the state, Missouri, for much of the time, literally outlawed blacks from going any higher than the 8th grade. So a lot of the blacks who came to Iowa south of 34 did so to complete high school. So that also was one of the other sources of why, when you look at the census and demographic patterns of living, you see much larger concentrations of blacks, especially from St. Joseph and Kansas City coming up, because they were able to complete high school.
Okay. Thank you for that information. And you saw that I pulled out a business card. That's my desire to communicate with you after this presentation, because you possess the kind of information that we certainly have to incorporate into the story that we tell in the museum. Yes, sir, right here.
You did bring up Dred Scott as a critical point in the black history here. Are you aware of the role that Johnson County and Iowa City played in his escape after the Kansas Bloody War?
No, I'm not.
John Brown and his loyal followers did escape from Kansas, and they fled to Springdale, a nearby community, and wintered at Springdale. And one evening, John Brown was dining here in Iowa City with some of the prominent citizens. John Brown's lookouts discovered that the federal authorities were getting close. And he warned John Brown, and those prominent citizens then arranged for John Brown to escape again on a freight train as it went eastward through Iowa City. That's the story. Also, there is in the archives in the Historical Society building here in Iowa City a cannon that was John Brown's and was used during the bloody Kansas War.
You know, when I relate to the activities of John Brown to some of my Southern colleagues, the one comment I get is axe murderer. And see, those are the kind of attitudes that I have to deal with, you know, in trying to interpret this story that we're trying to interpret. But thank you for that information. As you can see, I pulled out another business card, and you see, you're one of the ones that I'm going to have to communicate with after this event. And there's a gentleman right in the back.
The slave who went on the Lewis and Clark expedition actually was not freed. He remained a slave.
Right. Okay.
He remained a slave until I think 6 years before his death. He was quite bitter about it, actually, understandably.
True. When he went back, everybody on the expedition got something, land, money, or they got something. And you're correct. York remained a slave when he went back.
Just wonder what plans you have, or plans the museum has to make these presentations to Iowa high schoolers or other ages or sending out information packets. I think there'd be some great discussions provoked by, like you said, the good, bad, and the ugly of the Black history in Iowa, and the receptivity or lack thereof in some towns, and dialogues that could come from these presentations to high schoolers.
We've got various outreach programs that we do. One such outreach program is this. We've got this in a form of a print, which we, through a grant from Norwest, and, well, Norwest was the major contributor to this. We sent them to every elementary school out there. And with that, we sent a schematic just like this. So that's out there. See that exhibit right there? That's ours. We've also got a large exhibit that's right now in Clinton. That exhibit has gone to Des Moines, gone to Ames, and that's a result of a grant from the Roy Carver Trust. Right now, we're working on another project called the Iowa's African American Elected Official. And it's simply a poster of Iowa's African American elected official. It's because this state is about probably 3% African American. But, you know, I started, when I first got the idea for that project, I said, you know, there's probably about 10 elected African American officials in this state. Then we started going into it, and then we're up to 25. And I think that's quite impressive. So with this poster that we're doing, we're going to make it available free of charge for anyone who wants it for posterity. They can use it. We've got people out there trying to recruit African Americans. If you want to use it for that reason, so be it. But I think we see this as a recruiting tool. But my point to you is we are doing outreach programs and activities. We are going to the schools and making ourselves available for anyone wanting to know the information. And anybody, you know, we're temporarily located in Westdale Mall, and anybody wanting to bring a group, you know, they're more than welcome. In fact, just before I left this morning, there had already been 2 groups. We had 3 more scheduled throughout the day. So we do have those opportunities available. Yes.
Hi, do you have your archives in Westdale Mall downstairs, or is it collected
We have someplace else. That's someplace being the History Center in Cedar Rapids. They're working with us on that because what we collect, I mean, it's so great and it's so sensitive that if we don't put it in the environmentally controlled area, of course we'll run that risk of them deteriorating. So we don't want that to happen. So the History Channel, they're in possession of some valuable stuff. You know, I told you we've got those artifacts from the doctor in McGregor, Clifford Smith. We acquired some materials from a gentleman in Des Moines. He was in the Peace Corps in the 1960s. You know, when it was legal to bring tusks out of that country. You know, we're in possession of one of those. That letter that I told you about, that 1944 letter, all that stuff is and more is at the History Center in Cedar Rapids.
You've got in terms of the facility that you're hoping to build for the center, do you have a location chosen for that?
We've got a location. It is city-owned property. They gave us an offer we can't refuse, $1 a year for 99 years. And it's across the river from the National Czech and Slovak Museum. So when you're planning those trips, wanting to know more about the ethnic diversity of this state, if you want to know about the Czech and Slovak population, the African-American population, you can do it all in one trip. And we can fit into all the other ethnic diversity throughout the state. You know, there's the Vesterheim Museum telling the Norwegian story. I've been there. Beautiful place. You know, there's the Amana colonies. There's more there than food. There is the Amish story. There is the German story and the Pella Dutch story. So, I mean, we can fit in to all this thing and help Iowa market itself as a place that interprets cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, all that stuff. Yes.
I was interested in your comment referring to the center as being a one-stop shop. And I wonder how much similar information is in the State Historical Library in Des Moines, and then if the Waterloo one is doing something that's different, will it really be a one-stop place, or is to really get a picture, are we going to need to visit all of them?
Yeah, well, I don't want to discourage you from visiting the rest, but I just want to let you know that everything that they have, we may not have the original stuff that they have, but we'll maybe have a copy. But we want to be able to, we know that Waterloo can interpret it better than we can. We want to be able to send you there. If we know that the State Historical Society can interpret it better than we can, we want to be able to send you there. And in the case of what the Fort Des Moines is interpreting, if they can do it better than we can, we want to be able to send you there. But, we want to be able to tell you the rest of the story, because we'll have it. Well, and that's our aim, that's our goal, and that's what we're going towards now. And I kind of touched on that, on telling you the stories that I told you. It's really fun going to the other parts of the state, because it's not all in the State Historical Society. I mean, they've done a good job so far. I mean, they've done an admirable job. But the deal with the State Historical Society, and it's not local to this state, is that African American history has been slighted for so long that it's probably a footnote in most places, if it's mentioned or interpreted or collected at all. And see, we don't want that to happen. We get calls, we get calls from representatives from the State Historical Society now. People have got some things that they want to give to them, but it's not within their realm of what they interpret. So for that reason, we want to be there to receive this stuff that may be in danger of not being in the realm of what they interpret. We want it, as long as it pertains to African American history, we want to have it in our possession. Yes.
Do you have plans to attend the University of Iowa Culture Diversity Day on February 25th at the University Field House? They have special displays over there if you connected with this.
I do believe I got an invitation from my board member. And I have not committed to it, sir. So I don't want to stand here and say I'm coming. I'll have to check my calendar, and I'm going to pull out another card so we can talk more about that. Any other questions, comments, gripes, complaints? Whoop, I said gripes. She raised her hand.
No gripes at all. I hope you've become acquainted with Elaine Estes in Des Moines, because she is going to be the incoming state questers president, with connections with all the questers in the state of Iowa who go to all the auctions and know all their town's histories, and maybe are people who will come across artifacts for you. So she would be an important connection.
Have you ever visited Elaine's home? That's a museum. Elaine, with our organization, falls into the same category as Dr. Hubbard. She is one of our connections in the Des Moines area. So yes, thank you. If there are no more questions, thank you, Margaret.
I just wanted to say that people might be interested when you look at this display. Dr. Hubbard had a connection with Patton. He played with his sons, and Dr. Hubbard was in Des Moines. And I don't know if he wants to just say something about that or not.
Your connection with Mr. Patton?
Oh, Mr. Patton?
Yes.
Robert Patton was a neighbor when I was growing up in Des Moines. He had 5 children, and 2 of them were my age, twins, Edward and Edwin. And his print shop was very well known, and his story has been told in the Palimpsest, the Iowa historical magazine. And so I was very pleased to see the exhibit out here, and I was looking to see if I could find in there a notice about an opera which was held in Des Moines, completely produced by African Americans around 1930. And I haven't been able to find the exact date, but it's important to me because my mother was in it and sang an aria. The opera was called Heaven Bound. But Mr. Patton and his family are very well known. His son-in-law is Lawrence Oliver, who was a well-known lawyer in Des Moines, and his daddy told him, he was from Arkansas, and his daddy told him, don't ever sell land. And so Oliver bought a piece of swamp in Des Moines and kept it for many years. And finally, it was in the right place, and so they filled it in, and there's a shopping mall now called Oliver Mall.
I need to add that this display back here is a small version of what is now displayed at the State Historical Building. I think the gentleman left. So if you want to see the larger exhibit, go to the State Historical Building, because they do a better job with that than we can. It was just our effort to get that snippet of that story and send it around the state so that everybody could have access to that. So again, thank you.
Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Joe, and congratulations, and best of luck in the future. And Professor Hubbard, it's always good to have you with us. And again, enjoy the week and enjoy the day. Take care.